Ethan Mercer had spent 15 years building one of the most unusual private estates in the Western Highlands, a massive stretch of rugged, elevated land surrounded by cliffs, restricted air corridors, and narrow mountain access roads that most people considered impossible to develop. While nearby luxury HOA communities focused on polished gates, golf carts, and petty enforcement rules, Ethan invested in something far more practical: infrastructure. He built emergency-grade roads, fuel storage, weather systems, and most importantly, a fully legal private helicopter landing pad used for transport, medical deliveries, wildfire inspections, and contractor access to remote properties. That landing pad became the exact thing the HOA board decided they wanted to control. What began as a petty land use dispute quickly turned into one of the strangest power grabs imaginable. The HOA believed Ethan's isolated helipad sat close enough to community-controlled air property to justify claiming oversight. Bro, hearing that kind of logic would make anyone stare at the wall for a second, but what they failed to understand was something buried deep in decades-old infrastructure records. Ethan didn't just own the landing pad. He controlled the only safe air access corridor for the entire mountain region, and once the HOA pushed too far, their own luxury expansion plans started collapsing one restriction at a time. 2. Ethan Mercer had never intended to become the unofficial backbone of an entire mountain district. Years earlier, when wealthy developers chased lakeside resorts and polished suburban compounds, Ethan bought what everyone mocked as useless highland acreage. The land was steep, uneven, and wrapped in harsh weather patterns that made construction expensive and frustrating. Most investors walked away after one site inspection. Ethan stayed. He had worked in industrial logistics, emergency transport planning, and remote infrastructure contracts long before retiring into private land development. He understood something most people ignored. Difficult land often became valuable when surrounding growth outpaced practical access. That exact prediction slowly became reality. The Western Ridge transformed over time. Luxury cabins appeared first, then private estates, and then vacation compounds, then one ambitious gated development managed by an aggressive homeowners association that marketed itself as elite mountain living. That HOA became known for polished newsletters, strict landscaping rules, and increasingly inflated confidence. At first, Ethan had almost nothing to do with them. His estate sat outside direct HOA ownership, protected by older land agreements and county-recognized utility rights, while HOA residents fought over fence stains, driveway widths, and decorative lighting standards. Ethan focused on real systems. He reinforced slopes against erosion, built storm drainage, expanded gravel transport lanes, added weather monitoring towers, installed backup generators, structured emergency fire breaks. Even local contractors quietly admitted his property was engineered better than many public utility sites. Then came the helipad. That was where everything changed. 3. Because Ethan's land sat on a stable upper plateau, he had one of the few naturally level ridges suitable for rotorcraft operations. Years before, he secured legal permits, aviation approvals, environmental reviews, and operational certifications for a private-use helicopter landing zone. It wasn't built for show. He used it for supply transport, inspection access, wildfire coordination, medical logistics, and aerial surveying. Mountain weather made road travel unreliable. He had access so that, over time, utility teams, surveyors, engineers, and emergency contractors relied on Ethan's access point more often than expected. Small private flights occasionally landed for approved operations. Forestry inspectors coordinated through his site. Fire prevention teams mapped ridge movement using his aerial routes. Bro, this was one of those quiet power situations people never notice until everything depends on it. He didn't advertise it. He didn't brag. He simply built systems before anyone else understood their value. Meanwhile, the neighboring HOA expanded aggressively. The board changed leadership twice in 4 years, each time becoming more obsessed with image, territory, and influence. Their newest president, Randall Pierce, was the exact kind of administrator who treated authority like performance theater. He loved procedural overreach, polished legal letters, and community control language stretched far beyond common sense. Under Randall, the HOA started absorbing influence around the district. They negotiated road easements, pressed neighboring landowners into shared compliance agreements, expanded architectural review powers, lobbied for landscaping restrictions near scenic overlooks, created visual harmony complaints against properties they didn't even own. Most people paid fines, and some resisted briefly. Few wanted prolonged disputes. Ethan ignored them. That irritated Randall more than any argument would have. Because Ethan represented something the HOA could not dominate: a self-contained property, no dues, no board approval, no design oversight, no dependency, and visible from several expensive HOA ridge homes was Ethan's helicopter pad. That alone became a fixation. Residents occasionally complained that helicopters disrupted premium mountain tranquility. Others argued aircraft movement made the area feel industrial. A few demanded visual shielding. One developer privately worried that future luxury resale buyers might view aviation activity as undesirable. Instead of leaving it alone, the HOA started framing the helipad as a community concern. At first it seemed harmless: requests, reviews, informal notices, air noise questions, property use inquiries. Then legal language sharpened. They claimed Ethan's upper plateau bordered shared environmental influence zones. Then they argued air movement over HOA and visible space created indirect jurisdiction concerns. And then they hinted his aviation operations should undergo HOA compatibility review. And that was absurd. HOAs regulate community covenants, not independent air access infrastructure. But Randall escalated anyway. County staff dismissed the issue. Aviation regulators ignored HOA complaints. Survey records contradicted them. So the HOA shifted tactics. They attacked through optics. Newsletters described unregulated, elevated transport activity. Board circulars discussed private operational structures affecting shared mountain aesthetics. Investors heard rumors. Contractors heard rumors. Potential buyers heard rumors. That was the first real annoyance Ethan felt. Not fear, annoyance. Because reputation damage wasted time, he responded carefully. He gathered land maps, permit copies, air corridor approvals, and operational logs, historic easements, engineering records. Everything organized. Still, Randall pushed harder, and then the HOA announced a luxury expansion proposal, 5 that explained everything. They wanted to build an elevated ridge retreat, featuring premium villas, observation decks, and private scenic access near Ethan's side of the mountain district. Marketing materials hinted at aerial tourism, possibilities, premium evacuation access, and future executive transport partnerships. And there was one enormous problem: safe air access. Most of the ridge had unstable downdrafts, dangerous crosswinds, and obstructed approach angles. Aviation consultants had warned developers years earlier that only one consistent corridor allowed safe helicopter approach into that upper zone. That route crossed controlled elevation and operational spacing Ethan legally managed, and that fact had apparently never been fully understood by the HOA. Bro, when hidden infrastructure rights suddenly matter, that's where stories get wild. Ethan discovered their oversight while reviewing county aviation overlays. He stared at decades-old air logistics filings tied to emergency use planning, private access permissions, and maintained clearance control agreements. His plateau wasn't just a helipad. His land and recorded control zones affected coordinated rotor access for the only safe mountain entry path in specific weather windows. Not full air ownership, obviously, but operationally massive leverage, especially for private low-altitude approved corridor use. He stayed quiet. That mattered. He could have immediately crushed their expansion assumptions. Instead, he watched. Because pressure reveals intent, the HOA then crossed into open aggression. They issued a formal compliance claim asserting Ethan's helipad structure required review under regional community impact standards. They implied seizure risk through forced utility restrictions. They referenced shared development safety. They threatened legal petitions. That word stood out. Seizure. 6. An HOA trying to pressure indirect control over private aviation infrastructure outside their jurisdiction. That was bold or reckless, probably both. Ethan hired specialists and attorneys, aviation consultants, historical survey analysts, infrastructure planners. Everything was reviewed, every filing aligned, every permit stood, every easement held. And then came the discovery that shifted the entire battle. Years earlier, Ethan had quietly purchased and consolidated several fragmented ridge parcels tied to abandoned logistics rights. Most buyers ignored them because they looked useless. Narrow strips, survey fragments, elevated clearances, maintenance zones. But together, they formed the protected operational perimeter, influencing the only practical stabilized helicopter approach path used for private access. The HOA had tried to dominate the one man who indirectly controlled the air practicality of their future luxury district. That irony was incredible. Still, Ethan did not retaliate. Not yet. And instead, malicious compliance started taking shape. He reviewed every legal operating boundary, every scheduling priority, every safety filing, every environmental review window, every maintenance requirement. If the HOA wanted regulation, Ethan would become the most regulation-compliant landowner the mountain had ever seen. Inspection windows tightened. Flight approvals followed exact protocol. Noise buffers became stricter. The broad spacing adhered to textbook standards. External access permissions required. Perfect documentation. Shared contractor use became highly selective. Temporary courtesy flexibility ended. Not revenge. Compliance. Pure, flawless compliance. And suddenly people felt it. Developers experienced delays. Survey flights became harder. Private inspection scheduling narrowed. Ridge planning assumptions shifted. Air tour feasibility weakened. Emergency coordination timelines tightened. Nothing illegal. 7. Nothing hostile. Just exact boundaries. That's exactly how real power works sometimes. Not loud anger. Precision. Randall misread it. He thought Ethan was folding into pressure. Instead, Ethan was documenting everything while preserving leverage. The HOA doubled down publicly. They announced review committees, property use audits, and environmental visibility claims, regional compatibility petitions. Luxury investors started asking questions. Aviation consultants re-entered planning discussions. Insurance groups flagged access risk concerns. Construction forecasts slowed. And for the first time, Randall Pierce faced something he didn't understand. He could pressure homeowners. He could fine residents. He could intimidate landscapers. He could weaponize bureaucracy. But he had picked a fight with a man who built infrastructure before power games even began. And now the Mountain District was quietly learning that Ethan Mercer had never been isolated. He had been positioned. Every ridge, every corridor, every approval file, every overlooked parcel, every silent purchase. It had all been preparation. The HOA thought they were seizing a helipad. They were standing at the edge of a much larger mistake. And soon Ethan would stop merely complying. He would start escalating. By the time autumn rolled over the western ridge, the dispute between Ethan Mercer and the HOA had stopped being a petty land use annoyance and started affecting the entire mountain district. What had once looked like a minor argument over a private helicopter pad had now grown into a layered infrastructure conflict involving developers, insurers, survey teams, aviation consultants, and wealthy investors who had quietly tied millions into the HOA's luxury expansion plans. And Randall Pierce still thought pressure would win. That alone was incredible. 8. Because Ethan had spent his entire professional life solving problems created by overconfident people who underestimated systems. And the HOA board, however, saw everything to control. When their early legal threats failed, they shifted into administrative escalation. Publicly, they framed it as community review. Privately, they treated Ethan like an obstacle that needed to be boxed in until he either complied or surrendered operational flexibility. The first move came through access pressure. The HOA controlled one of the polished lower ridge roads often used by contractors and luxury builders traveling towards shared highland routes. Although Ethan's core estate had independent access, some subcontractors occasionally crossed adjoining public-to-private transfer sections near HOA-managed territory for convenience. Suddenly, route permissions became slower, inspection stops increased, temporary vehicle checks appeared, safety review notices started affecting delivery timing. Nothing directly illegal, nothing openly targeted, but extremely intentional. Bro, this was textbook PowerFlex behavior. Randall clearly believed Ethan would eventually get frustrated enough to negotiate. Instead, Ethan adapted. He reopened abandoned gravel transport lanes across older ridge parcels he had purchased years earlier. He reinforced drainage, graded difficult turns, and brought in heavy equipment through independent access channels of the HOA had forgotten even existed. Within weeks, contractor reliance on HOA-adjacent convenience roads dropped sharply. That first pressure tactic failed, and then the board attacked through influence. They contacted regional vendors, quietly discouraged service partnerships, raised concerns about long-term legal uncertainty around Ethan's aviation activity, suggested operational disputes might impact future projects. Some small contractors hesitated, a few delayed work, one inspection firm withdrew temporarily. Now and again, Randall assumed isolation would weaken Ethan. Instead, Ethan did what experienced infrastructure people always do. He diversified. He replaced local dependencies with external operators, independent transport crews, private survey specialists, remote engineering consultants, certified aviation contractors from outside the district. These teams cared about permits, safety, and payment, not HOA gossip. The estate kept functioning. Actually, it became more efficient. That had to sting. Meanwhile, Ethan continued strict compliance. His helicopter pad operations became almost surgically precise. Every arrival logged, every departure documented, wind conditions verified, fuel handling inspected, wildfire clearances updated, emergency use pathways reviewed, approach windows calibrated under exact aviation guidance, and no shortcuts, no informal favors, no gray zone convenience. That shift quietly changed everything. Because for years, Ethan had allowed occasional flexibility to neighboring developments. Survey flights, contractor transfers, approved aerial reviews, environmental scans. Not because he owed anyone access, but because it helped regional operations. Now he followed exact documented standards, and exact standards were narrower. Luxury developers suddenly discovered that casual expected access was not guaranteed access. Planned ridge surveys slowed, and environmental reviews required rescheduling. Investor-side flyovers became inconsistent. Premium aerial marketing footage got delayed. Construction projections slipped. Again, nothing aggressive, just flawless compliance. That kind of revenge energy was almost beautiful because it wasn't the revenge on paper. It was precision. Randall still refused to back off. Instead, the HOA board escalated publicly. In a regional property planning session, they pushed new language describing Ethan's helipad as a high-impact private transport installation adjacent to community expansion interests. That phrase spread fast. Developers started asking what exactly adjacent interests meant, and law firms asked, insurers asked, aviation consultants asked, and the answers were messy. Because the HOA was implying influence over something they didn't legally control. That raised risk. Risk slowed money. Money hates uncertainty. And then Ethan made his next move, still legal, still measured, still devastating, He initiated a full operational review of every privately managed elevated parcel tied to his ridge network. Years earlier, when fragmented landowners sold off awkward strips of mountain property, Ethan had quietly bought them. Most were steep utility corridors, maintenance shoulders, drainage rights, and overlooked ridge cut-throughs. Developers thought they were junk. They were. Together, they formed a web of infrastructure relevance: helicopter spacing, service staging, emergency maneuvering, weather positioning, and ground support access, even backup ridge alignment. The more experts reviewed the district, the clearer it became. Ethan's holdings touched far more operational logistics than anyone had realized. That revelation triggered nervous conversations. Insurance underwriters began rechecking assumptions. Luxury expansion consultants requested new assessments. Environmental planners revisited transport overlays. Potential investors delayed commitment meetings. And Randall Pierce, who had proudly marketed the HOA's future executive ridge experience, started facing questions he could not confidently answer. That was only half the escalation. Then winter prep began. Mountain weather always separated theory from reality. Roads narrowed, fog thickened, wind patterns shifted, emergency access became critical. 11. Historically, Ethan had cooperated widely with neighboring operations during difficult seasonal conditions. Shared visibility, coordination, weather alerts, aerial assessments, route advisories, small things that saved time and prevented chaos. And now he found exact responsibility limits. If a system wasn't contractually covered, it wasn't provided. If a request lacked documentation, it waited. If an access issue fell outside approved scope, it stayed outside scope. Again, not hostility and compliance. And suddenly the HOA expansion district felt fragile. Luxury developers had assumed rugged prestige. They were now experiencing rugged logistics. Emergency planning meetings multiplied. Costs increased. Project delays widened. High net worth buyers started hearing phrases nobody likes: access limitations, seasonal aviation risk, infrastructure dependency, review pending. That kind of language can quietly collapse confidence. Randall panicked but disguised it as aggression. He launched what became his worst mistake. The HOA filed a formal petition requesting county-level review of Ethan's helipad regional compatibility status, attempting to frame it as a public interest safety issue. They wanted leverage. They got a scrutiny. County engineers reopened records. Survey teams reviewed ridge infrastructure. Aviation specialists reassessed corridor logic. Historical access filings surfaced. And buried in decades of overlooked documentation sat the truth Randall had never understood. Ethan's network had long-standing logistical importance in emergency and stabilized private air access planning, not because he owned the sky, but because terrain, weather behavior, elevation, and lawful corridor management made his ridge strategically central. The petition accidentally spotlighted his importance. Bro, that kind of self-inflicted damage is unreal. The county didn't side with Ethan emotionally. They simply followed records. 12, which was worse for Randall, because records don't care about ego. As findings circulated, developers quietly shifted. Some distanced themselves from HOA-led expansion dependence. A few started negotiating directly with independent planners. One major investor paused capital allocation pending long-term access clarification. The HOA's polished confidence cracked. Residents began noticing. Questions spread. Why were projects slowing? Why were consultants revisiting maps? Why were costs rising? But why was air corridor dependency suddenly part of planning conversations? Randall tried controlling narrative through newsletters and board messaging, but pressure had changed sides. Then Ethan escalated in a way only someone deeply patient would. He audited every courtesy arrangement still benefiting surrounding developments. Equipment staging, temporary storage, seasonal route sharing, operational advisories, support access. If agreements existed, they remained. If they were informal, they ended, and that was huge because mountain communities often survive on informal professional cooperation. When precision replaces convenience, inefficiency multiplies. Suddenly, more transport costs, longer route planning, duplicate inspections, delayed heavy equipment movement, restricted timing windows, no sabotage, no interference, no threats, just lawful boundaries. That's exactly how malicious compliance becomes devastating. Randall attempted one final intimidation push. He floated legal rumors suggesting broader district review powers. That backfired immediately. Attorneys challenged scope, consultants pushed back, investors hated uncertainty, and neighboring landowners, who had watched the HOA overreach for years, began resisting their own compliance requests. The board's authority image weakened. People started seeing what Ethan had seen early. Randall's power worked best when others assumed he was stronger than he actually was. 13 now, that illusion was fading. By late winter, the Ridge District looked entirely different. The HOA's luxury expansion remained technically alive, but slowed, complicated, expensive, questioned. Ethan's estate, meanwhile, ran cleaner than ever, efficient, documented, legally fortified, operationally respected. He hadn't shouted, he hadn't retaliated emotionally, he had simply turned precision into leverage. And Randall Pierce still hadn't understood the worst part. Everything so far had only been defensive escalation, and Ethan had not yet entered the real revenge phase. The HOA tried to seize his helicopter pad. Soon, Ethan would show them what happened when the man controlling practical air access stopped merely defending territory and started reshaping the entire mountain power structure. By early spring, the mountain district had reached a breaking point. What started as an arrogant HOA attempt to pressure Ethan Mercer into surrendering control over his helicopter pad had now turned into a financial, legal, and reputational problem stretching far beyond one ridge. Luxury developers were nervous, consultants were cautious, and investors were treating every HOA-led promise with suspicion. Randall Pierce still chaired board meetings with polished confidence, but behind the carefully managed image, the structure he had spent years tightening around others was starting to crack, and Ethan finally stopped playing only defense. That shift was subtle at first. He did not retaliate through lawsuits, dramatic public fights, or reckless moves. He knew emotional escalation would make him look unstable. Instead, he chose something colder and far more effective. He became proactive. 14. After months of documenting every delay, every false jurisdiction claim, every indirect pressure tactic, and every operational disruption tied to HOA overreach, Ethan's legal team completed a layered review of board conduct. What they discovered wasn't explosive criminal behavior or sensational corruption. It was something much more dangerous in property disputes: patterns of administrative overreach, misleading claims, improper influence attempts, and repeated misuse of authority language beyond legitimate HOA scope. That was enough. Not to destroy them, but to expose them. Bro, this was where patience started paying off. Ethan submitted formal counterfilings through county channels and regional planning review boards. He challenged the HOA's compatibility claims, disputed improper operational interference, and requested independent evaluation of how HOA actions had affected infrastructure planning, investor risk assumptions, and neighboring landowner rights. That triggered neutral review, and neutral review was the last thing Randall wanted. Because unlike HOA-controlled messaging, outside reviewers asked direct questions. Where had the board obtained authority assumptions over non-member aviation infrastructure? Why had regional control language appeared in internal notices? Why had developers been led to believe future air access certainty existed without proper corridor analysis? Why had administrative pressure continued after earlier dismissals? The answers were weak, sometimes vague, sometimes contradictory, sometimes embarrassingly procedural. Meanwhile, Ethan quietly made his biggest strategic move yet. He formalized an independent Ridge Access Consortium. That sounded boring. It was devastating. And 15. Using his privately owned ridge parcels, legal access networks, and long-established operational control zones, Ethan partnered with nearby non-HOA landowners, contractors, logistics planners, and emergency use consultants to create a structured independent access framework for highland transport, maintenance coordination, seasonal support, and aerial scheduling. In simple terms, he organized the mountain without the HOA. That was incredible. Because Randall's influence had always depended on acting like the HOA was the central authority around the district. Ethan replaced that illusion with a lawful alternative built around infrastructure rather than image. Landowners joined, transport operators joined, engineering firms joined, emergency planners coordinated, survey consultants preferred the clarity. Even some developers began redirecting communication through consortium planning channels instead of HOA intermediaries. Randall lost narrative control, and then money started moving. One investor group tied to the HOA's luxury ridge expansion requested revised risk forecasts. Another delayed phased construction. A premium villa project was quietly scaled back. Marketing promises referencing smooth executive transport became heavily reworded. Insurance costs increased. Aerial access assumptions weakened. The polished, exclusive ridge future started looking expensive and unstable. Residents noticed, not just investors, actual homeowners. Many had tolerated Randall's aggressive leadership because rising prestige made people overlook bad governance. But now, rising fees, delayed improvements, and stalled projects were becoming visible. Questions spread. Why had legal costs increased? Why were outside consultants reviewing old disputes? Why were regional planners bypassing HOA influence? Why had expansion projections slowed? Why were insurance assessments changing? Randall answered through carefully worded updates. 16, but confidence was slipping. Then Ethan escalated through precision again. He opened control, contract-based air coordination partnerships, legally, selectively, and under strict operational terms through his ridge network and consortium-approved planning. This mattered because previously, the HOA had acted like his helicopter infrastructure was a nuisance. Now, surrounding professionals openly treated it as a critical regional utility support. Survey flights, emergency drills, wildfire mapping, infrastructure inspection routes, environmental assessments, all structured, all documented, all legitimate, and all proving value. That public contrast crushed the HOA's framing, and they had tried to portray his helipad as disruptive. Reality showed it was useful. That reversal was brutal. Bro, that's exactly the kind of power shift that flips entire stories. Randall panicked. Instead of de-escalating, he pushed one final aggressive measure. He proposed a district alignment initiative designed to tighten visual and access review powers around neighboring highland development zones. It was dressed up like planning reform. But everyone could read the subtext: more control, more reach, more pressure, and this time resistance exploded. Independent landowners objected. Consultants criticized overlap. Legal advisors flagged scope concerns. Developers disliked uncertainty. County planners questioned relevance. Even some HOA residents began openly challenging board priorities. Randall had overplayed authority. Again, and then came the review findings. So county and regional assessments didn't punish the HOA in dramatic fashion. Real life rarely works like that. And instead, they did something worse. They clarified. They reaffirmed Ethan's lawful operational standing, rejected implied HOA jurisdiction over his air access infrastructure, noted concerns around overextended authority framing, 17 reinforced limits on board reach over independent, non-member holdings. That stripped Randall's strongest weapon, perceived control. Once official boundaries became clear, his intimidation strategy weakened fast. And then Ethan made the move that changed the balance permanently. Using consortium leverage, parcel access logic, and expanding regional credibility, He negotiated infrastructure coordination agreements directly with parties the HOA had once assumed would depend on them. Utility contractors, seasonal transport planners, emergency support teams, inspection groups, even development consultants, not ownership, not takeover, influence, functional influence, and this time it was built on systems, not ego. The HOA's luxury expansion now faced a brutal truth, but if they wanted efficient future logistics, stable seasonal support, or practical ridge coordination, they increasingly had to operate around structures Ethan had helped organize. The man they tried to corner had quietly become central. Randall's authority visibly weakened. Board unity fractured. Residents pushed for transparency. Developers reduced optimism. Costs climbed. Legal reviews stayed active. And Ethan Mercer, who once simply defended his private helipad, was no longer reacting. He was reshaping how the entire mountain district operated. But the real revenge wasn't complete yet, because part 2 would hit where Randall cared most. Status, control, and the reputation he'd spent years building. By late spring, Randall Pierce was no longer fighting Ethan Mercer over a helicopter pad. He was fighting collapse. Not physical collapse, not dramatic disaster, something worse for a man built on appearances. Institutional collapse. 18. The power structure Randall had carefully inflated through years of pressure, polished messaging, and aggressive HOA expansion was beginning to fail under its own overreach. Every decision he had framed as community leadership was now being re-examined by residents, consultants, investors, and neighboring landowners who had started seeing a pattern Ethan had recognized long ago. Randall's authority had always depended on one fragile thing: people believing he controlled more than he actually did. Now that illusion was fading, and Ethan decided it was time to end it. His revenge was not emotional. It was structural. That made it brilliant. After strengthening the Independent Ridge Consortium, Ethan shifted from protecting infrastructure to exposing contrast. He knew reputation changes faster when people compare performance, not speeches. So while the HOA struggled with legal reviews, delayed planning, and rising distrust, Ethan expanded practical coordination across the district. Seasonal transport networks became thinner. Emergency routing became faster. Independent landowners gained clearer planning support. Survey scheduling became more reliable. Aerial inspection partnerships expanded. Wildfire prep systems improved. Weather reporting became better organized. Support crews preferred consortium channels because procedures were predictable. Everything looked calm, professional, efficient, and that was devastating because Randall's model had always been bureaucracy with image. Ethan's model became infrastructure with results. Bro, that type of comparison destroys ego quietly. The more the district relied on structured systems outside HOA influence, the weaker Randall looked. And then the financial pressure hit. 19. Developers reviewing the stalled Luxury Ridge expansion started making practical decisions. Several future amenities tied to executive transport branding were paused indefinitely. Premium aerial tour positioning was scaled back. Forecasts were rewritten. Insurance premiums remained elevated because earlier uncertainty had complicated long-term assumptions. One secondary investment group withdrew from optional expansion planning. Another reduced phased commitment that mattered, not because Ethan attacked investors, he didn't. They simply no longer trusted aggressive projections tied to unstable oversight. Then homeowners began asking the hardest question in any HOA conflict: what had all this cost? Legal reviews, consultants, delayed projects, administrative overhead, outside assessments, risk studies, board-driven planning changes, all expensive. Residents started linking rising fees and slowing improvements to Randall's overreach. Landscape upgrades had stalled, shared maintenance schedules slipped, minor community improvements got delayed, reserve discussions became tense. People who once admired Randall's polished leadership began seeing something else: a man obsessed with reach. That reversal was massive. For years, he had looked powerful. Now he looked costly, and Ethan hadn't publicly attacked him once, and that was incredible. Still, Randall refused to accept decline. He tried rebuilding authority through optics. He launched newsletters about future district stability, held tightly managed board briefings, promoted internal review reforms, reframed expansion slowdowns as strategic recalibration. But reality was stronger than wording. Then came the event that ended his control. An independent transparency review, triggered by mounting internal pressure and regional scrutiny, forced broader examination of board decision patterns tied to external land influence, advisory communication, and expansion assumptions. 20 again, not scandal, not crime, something far more believable: governance overreach, poor judgment, repeated boundary stretching, misleading confidence, improper prioritization. Residents hated that because people can tolerate strict leadership. They rarely tolerate expensive ego, and the review didn't, destroy the HOA. Instead, it damaged trust in Randall. Board members began distancing themselves. Subcommittees questioned past approvals. Residents demanded accountability. Some senior homeowners pushed for leadership restructuring. Developers shifted communication toward neutral planning channels. Randall was still technically present, but power had already moved. That's exactly how authority dies sometimes. Before titles change, then Ethan delivered his cleanest revenge move. He hosted a formal regional infrastructure coordination summit. No drama. No attacks, no speeches aimed at Randall. Just professionals, landowners, transport planners, emergency consultants, survey teams, environmental coordinators, utility representatives, independent developers. The purpose was simple: improve long-term highland logistics, seasonal resilience, access planning, and cooperative infrastructure use across the Mountain District. It was lawful, open, practical, and symbolically devastating, because the man the HOA once tried to frame as an isolated private nuisance had become the central organizer of regional function. People showed up, they collaborated, and they aligned, and they signed cooperative planning understandings. Nothing flashy, everything meaningful. And notably, many parties the HOA once assumed would route influence through Randall were now working around structures Ethan helped organize. That visual alone crushed reputation. Bro, hearing that twist would blow anyone's mind. Then the final humiliation happened naturally. 21. The HOA's Luxury Ridge expansion, once marketed as a prestige symbol, was formally reduced into a narrower, slower, lower-risk phased development plan, stripped of several premium assumptions. Observation luxury packages scaled down, transport branding softened, executive access positioning removed, aerial exclusivity language dropped, projected timelines extended. What was once framed as dominant expansion became cautious adaptation. Randall's vision had shrunk. Ethan's systems had expanded. That contrast was brutal. Within months, internal HOA pressure forced leadership transition discussions. Randall did not disappear in dramatic fashion. Real property conflicts rarely end like movies. Instead, influence drained, committee authority narrowed, residents demanded oversight, decision power shifted, board posture softened. Eventually, Randall stepped away from practical leadership relevance. The title mattered less than the truth. He no longer controlled the mountain conversation. Ethan never celebrated publicly, and that made the ending stronger. He returned to what he had always valued: function over ego. His helicopter pad remained active. His ridge parcels remained protected. His consortium matured. His infrastructure became regionally respected. Emergency systems improved. Contractors trusted him. Landowners coordinated with him. Developers treated him as serious. And the exact thing the HOA once tried to seize had become the foundation of his quiet dominance. The helicopter pad wasn't the victory. Control of practical access had always been. Randall thought power came from claiming authority. Ethan proved real power often comes from understanding systems before anyone else notices them. And now the revenge phase was complete. All that remained was aftermath. What changed, who learned, and why this entire mountain district would remember one expensive HOA mistake for years. 22. By the start of summer, the Western Ridge no longer felt like a district ruled by one aggressive HOA board pretending to control everything around it. The months of overreach, failed pressure tactics, delayed expansion plans, and expensive authority games had changed the entire mountain landscape. Ethan Mercer had not won through dramatic revenge, lawsuits, or loud public humiliation. He had won through patience, documentation, infrastructure, and exact legal boundaries. That made the ending feel real. After Randall Pierce lost practical influence, the HOA slowly shifted into damage control. New internal oversight committees reviewed planning priorities, legal expenses, and board authority limits. Residents who had once ignored aggressive leadership because property values looked strong now cared deeply about accountability. Rising fees, stalled improvements, and reduced luxury expansion promises had forced people to finally connect image-based leadership with actual consequences. The HOA itself survived, but it changed. Its reach narrowed, its tone softened, its ability to pressure neighboring independent landowners almost disappeared. That alone was one of the biggest reversals in the district. Bro, this was exactly how ego-based control starts collapsing when people stop being impressed by polished authority. Meanwhile, Ethan never tried to dominate the HOA or publicly embarrass anyone. He stayed focused on what had always mattered: function. His helicopter pad remained fully active and legally protected. But after everything had happened, people no longer saw it as a private nuisance or strange luxury feature. It had become recognized as an essential part of mountain logistics. Emergency teams coordinated through his approved systems, survey contractors trusted his scheduling network, wildfire planning groups valued his ridge access, independent landowners increasingly joined the consortium he had helped create. 23. What once looked like isolated private infrastructure had turned into respected regional support. That was incredible, and the Independent Ridge Consortium also matured into something larger than Ethan originally planned. Instead of acting as a revenge tool, it became a practical network for seasonal transport, coordination, route planning, weather alerts, maintenance access, and infrastructure cooperation between non-HOA properties. Developers who once relied too heavily on HOA assumptions now work through clearer logistics channels backed by documentation and real-world function, and that shift permanently changed district power, not political power, operational power, and operational power lasted longer. The scaled-down luxury expansion still moved forward, but slowly and realistically. Several flashy features Randall once promoted disappeared entirely. Premium transport branding softened. Overconfident projections were replaced by cautious planning. Investors treated the mountain district with more seriousness and less hype. Ethan watched all of it quietly. He never treated revenge like celebration, because the real lesson had already proven itself. The HOA tried to seize his helicopter pad because they thought it was just another asset they could pressure into submission. They didn't understand. They were targeting a man who had spent years building systems, buying overlooked land, and protecting infrastructure before anyone realized how valuable it would become. In the end, Ethan Mercer kept everything he built. His land, his access, his reputation, his leverage, and the mountain district learned something unforgettable. Control built on ego fades fast. Control built on preparation lasts. 24 months later, the Western Ridge had fully changed. Randall Pierce's aggressive HOA control was remembered as an expensive lesson in overreach, while Ethan Mercer's quiet patience became the reason the district finally respected infrastructure over empty authority. His helicopter pad stayed active, his consortium stayed strong, and the mountain no longer moved around ego-driven power games. Bro, that entire turnaround was wild because Ethan never Sometimes the strongest payback is letting overconfident people collapse under their own pressure. If you enjoyed this HOA property revenge story, like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me what Ethan's smartest move was. More insane HOA drama is coming next.